On today's World Insight, the road to global recovery and growth with China at the forefront. How sustainable amid a pandemic surge and slow vaccine rollout among major economies. Insights from the former governor of the People's Bank of China.
现在最主要的也要等待疫苗取得的这控制。
And with China and the U.S. on board with joint climate action, how can the United Nations help keep the momentum? The UN resident coordinator in China gets us up to speed.
As the UN, we welcome this, and now it's really rolling up our sleeves and coming down to the practical aspects of it.
When the sea is calm, anyone can steer the helm. When it's getting stormy, it takes faith and skills to brave the tide and even surf it toward common prosperity. That's what I witnessed in Boao over the years. This year, I'm here again. And I'll bring you to both heated discussions and important interviews. In the process, get encouraged and inspired by the powerful minds gathered here and the resolve to make the right things happen. Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Boao Forum for Asia. I'm Tian Wei. Amid the worsening pandemic, global policymakers did whatever was necessary, using all the tools in their arsenal to calm financial markets. In China, the first quarter GDP reached a record growth rate, confirming a momentum of robust and steady recovery. How effective are monetary and fiscal policies in steering economies toward growth? On Monday's Boao Forum for Asia, I hosted the panel Dialogue, Globalization in the Post-Pandemic Era with Mr. Zhou Xiaochuan, former governor of People's Bank of China, and Timothy Geithner, former Secretary of Treasury from the United States. Here's my conversation with Governor Zhou Xiaochuan, who is a sage economic thinker with a deep fiscal understanding of China and the international financial system. 我要请教周行长，您在2008年金融危机之后都发挥了巨大的作用。
Mr. Zhou, you have played a vital role after the 2008 financial crisis. At the same time, you are also coordinating and dealing with global policies. The crisis we're now experiencing seems to be larger in scale. What do you think of these two crises? And how do you define the measures taken by the international communities and different countries so far, especially on the topic of globalization today?
您如何来界定？与此同时，这意味着什么？特别是对我们今天的这个话题——全球化 （globalization）。周行长，有请。
虽然说这次疫情引起的这个对经济的冲击
The epidemic's impact on the economy is huge. As you said, it may be even greater than the 2008 financial crisis. But the nature is indeed different. We say that the epidemic has affected economic activities that account for 20 to 30% of the GDP. Because people can no longer travel freely and have to socially distance, some industries have ground to a halt.
所以有一些产业呢就停止运行了。所以呢，这时候呢，从财政、金融啊，从其他经济政策来讲呢，我一直用一个词儿呢，叫按下暂停键。
So, at this time, from the perspective of economic policies, I have always used an analogy, pressing the pause button. Later, I realized some leaders have also adopted this analogy. You have to stop temporarily, with financial policies containing the spread and gearing up for economic recovery. But it is true that economic and financial policies are never a cure to the problems brought by the epidemic. It is never a cure for the disease. The last financial crisis was caused by the economic and financial system itself, such as problems with the subprime mortgage crisis.
危机啊，这些出了问题，所以你自己要治病，治的哪些病呢？你比如说监管又薄弱了，这个是吧？这个有些机构这出了问题要救助了，这个大而不能倒，需要解决了。这个影子银行需要。
So we have to look for our own problems within the system. For example, the weak supervision, the shadow banking system, and there are some institutions that need to be rescued. There are also inherent problems in the product market. So, there is a lot that we have to improve within the system. So although the situation is very serious this time, you really have to wait until the epidemic is under control And the most important thing now is to wait for the mass rollout of vaccines. After all, macroeconomic policies and financial policies can't replace medicine and science in solving the epidemic problems.
这个代替了医学、医疗科学和这个流行病的解决，你解决不了。但是呢，在这个过程中，我们都共同的呢需要减轻疫情对这个经济的冲击。
But while in this process, we all need to alleviate the impact of the epidemic on the economy, especially for those service-oriented companies, and try to avoid the disintegration of these small and medium-sized enterprises to prevent people falling into poverty. Otherwise, it will be extremely hard to recover from the damage.
怎么恢复啊？是吧？那就困难了，啊，同时呢，这个还可能呢，尽可能的稍微拉动一些需求。
At the same time, it is possible to stimulate as much demand as possible. If there is a chance for recovery, we need to support and accelerate this recovery. Profound impact on globalization. So we must strive to uphold globalization.
就是您刚才提到全球化有冲击，所以呢更要提醒呢我们要这个想办法呢。 这个更加付出努力来维护这个全球化。
什么样的全球化
What kind of globalization?
这个全球化是多方面的，是吧？既包括这个。
Globalization is multifaceted. It needs mutual trust in the global political and economic system, and free flow of global trade and investment. We talk about the financial cooperation and issues brought by the epidemic, including prospects of the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the debt problem faced by some low-income countries under the epidemic.
怎么看待呢？有些受疫情影响的这个低收入国家的这个债务问题，是吧？包括呢，这个就是说全球来讲呢。
Globally, we need to mobilize more resources and funds to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. So this is why the IMF has recently reached a preliminary opinion through the G20 to endorse a $650 billion increase in currency aid to countries hit by the pandemic. And I think these policies are very important for driving globalization.
这个东西呢，都是我认为是全球化很重要的内容。
Also, we have some long-term issues, such as climate change. In the past 2 days, China and the United States have just concluded the meeting on climate cooperation. I've seen the press release. In addition, we will discuss biodiversity. These are global issues.
还要开这个生物多样性的这也都是全球性的这个议题。
要请教您了。
Mr. Zhou, I want to ask you about the current situation in China.
中国情况呢，其实说实在的，在座咱们很多听众都各有这个高见的，是吧？
The situation in China, in fact, many of our audience here have their own opinions. If I'm communicating with American friends, I would like to briefly say a few points. First, China is still an emerging economy. So many of our problems are identical to those in emerging market countries and transition economies. Like the past Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, we had a common problem with the transition from a planned economy to a market economy. This common problem is mainly through development and reform. It is still in the early stages of development, so there is a strong demand for development. At the same time, reforms must be passed to improve efficiency.
这个很旺盛，同时呢，也必须要通过改革，才能改进效率，才能把事情做得更好。那么呢，我们所体现的这个问题里头呢
，macro control is another challenge. Just like the United States, macro control has brought many problems, but it may be improved through reforms. In addition, our system has impediments, such as in the areas of science and technology, education, environmental protection, and more. Our development path is different from developed countries.
都是改革发展所具有的这种，跟这个发达国家呢，这是有一定区别的，是吧？第二个呢，我想呢，中国面临的问题呢，就是我们中国是属于这个 960万平方公里，14亿人。
The second problem I think China faces, China's vast land covers 9.6 million square kilometers, and we have 1.4 billion people. But there is very little arable land. So in general, China is a country with large resource carrying capacity load, and the country needs to feed 1.4 billion people. When development accelerates, problems with air pollution and environmental protection have all come out. If the country works on biodiversity, how to ensure the people are fed? This is an important issue that China should pay special attention to.
特别重视这样的问题。那么再有呢，就是中国呢，你看这个习主席特别强调，我们是这个坚决支持全球化。
As Chinese President Xi has highlighted, we firmly support globalization, advocate multilateralism, and an international rules-based order. And he emphasizes building a community with a shared future for mankind. But it is no easy job. Nowadays, everyone in the world has their own opinions, and we are facing a trust deficiency.
而这里头呢，又跟经济有很大关系，因为中国呢，说实在的，在大国经济里，属于对贸易啊，对于国际的这个资本流动啊，就投资进来、投资出去，依赖度都比较高的国家。
In this case, to uphold globalization can be a great challenge. It has a lot to do with the economy, because China has a relatively high degree of dependence on international capital flows and investments. Like the United States and Japan, they are all countries with a high degree of dependence on global trade activities. Therefore, we pay special attention to the multilateral and global international order. It is not easy to achieve.
作为一种发展中国家、新兴市场、转轨国家。
China, as a developing country, an emerging market, and a transition economy, we naturally have relatively strong fiscal and financial vulnerabilities. Although we do not see an urgent threat coming, we have to be careful with our fragility.
仔细看，脆弱性还是很强的，有一些金融机构不健康。
Some financial institutions are unhealthy, especially the recent small and medium financial institutions, as well as shadow banking institutions. The capital market also has some problems from time to time. It might seem that the debt ratio of the central government is not too high, but if you add local government debt and various financing platforms, the fiscal pressure is also very high. Therefore, there must be a sense of urgency in this regard. Although we may face different problems from that of the United States, but with a worsening pandemic and financial vulnerabilities, the pressure faced by many governments have all increased.
都有要有紧迫感，有危机感。这一点呢，虽然说这个问题细分下来里头的内容跟美国不一样，但是呢，我觉得可能在疫情的这种情况下呀，全球有不少地方这个财政金融的脆弱性呢都是增加了的。
我再补充问一小点，因为很多国际上的朋友们都。
Let me add one more point. Since many international friends are curious about the nature of China's dual circulation, can you explain it to us?
双循环这个也是我就是这2年学习也新学习的是吧？
Dual circulation is a term I got to know over the past 2 years. China, as a large country with a population of 1.4 billion, is naturally inclined to use internal circulation to build up the country's GDP. Therefore, it is essential to manage domestic demand and structural reforms in the supply chain. However, as a big country, I also mentioned China's dependence on foreign trade, and the proportion of China's capital inflows and outflows, including our investment in the Belt and Road Initiative, is huge. The proportion of foreign investment is larger than many other countries. So, this supplement is also very important.
流入的和流出的包括我们在“一带一路”上的这个投资，这个比重也是非常大的也比一般的大国都要大。那么这样的话呢，所以呢那一块的这个补充呢也是非常重要。再有一条呢，就是我们谈到呢，中国是个转轨经济。
One more thing is that we know China's economy is in transition. It has changed from a planned economy to a market economy that relies on globalization. So many things here are through cooperation with the outside world, such as trade and external investment. The reforms and opening up measures started from the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee. Where did these things come from? Many of them are brought about by the expansion of the outer circulation.
是吧？因此如果没有这一块的话呢，你们可以想象呢，中国我们说从11届三中全会开始的启动的这些改革开放措施，这些东西都从哪儿来的呢？有很多都是靠这个外循环的这个扩大所带来的。
很多人就在问啊，说全球治理当然应该是以规则为基础。
Many people are asking if global governance should be based on rules, but there are also many people are asking who makes the rules. Should the rules be changed, or should there be inclusiveness in the rule-making process? All these discussions have a very big impact on a global trading order.
基本上来讲呢，在全球贸易。
Basically speaking, in global trade, including service-related trade, trade-related investment, and intellectual property rights, there is still a general framework in this regard. And of course, there are many new problems. The most important of which is on this basis. We need to make further improvements and we cannot drive the car backwards.
面临的新的挑战呢，二战以后这么多年的这个关于财政金融方面的这个协调呢。
About the new challenges, the post-World War II fiscal and financial coordination is outdated. In the past, the main emphasis was on uneven development. Therefore, the World Bank was established to provide certain support to those countries lagging behind. This is also a fiscal and financial channel. The IMF is mainly to prevent financial instability, especially to solve the exchange rate problem and so on. But globalization today is different from that time. The demand for global public expenditures has increased. The issue of some high debt problems in low-income countries have to be resolved. The demand for financial systems maintaining stability is also growing. Although we have some coordination functions, there is no such institution that wants to be able to play a role of a global central bank. So we say that the entire multilateral mechanism needs to evolve continuously, and it needs to develop in terms of climate change and biodiversity. Although we have some United Nations agencies working on these things, the ability to mobilize resources is obviously not enough. Old things need to be improved, new problems need to be resolved. So one task is to take care of the voices of the world. Developed countries have the right to speak, but we should also listen to the demands of developing countries.
That's my conversation with former governor of the People's Bank of China, Zhou Xiaochuan. Throughout the week, I'm here in Boao bringing you the diverse and crucial voices of this changing world. Coming up, with China and the U.S. on board with joint climate action, how can the United Nations help keep the momentum? The UN resident coordinator in China gets us up to speed. Next.
As the UN, we welcome this, and now it's really rolling up our sleeves and coming down to the practical aspects of it.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me here at the Boao Forum for Asia. I'm Tian Wei. Last week, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, and his Chinese counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, issued a joint statement on climate crisis. The world's two largest economies are committed to climate action cooperation. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said on Monday that China-U.S. cooperation is vital and expressed hopes of reaching net zero emissions by mid-century. With China on a path to have a carbon emissions peak by the year 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060, how can the United Nations help China with climate actions and also spread the message across the world? Earlier, I spoke to Siddharth Chatterjee, the United Nations resident coordinator in China. Let's listen in. I want to start by asking your response toward the latest statement jointly released by the Chinese and American special envoys on climate change. What do you make of it from the UN resident coordinator's perspective?
You know, in December 2020, the UN Secretary General called upon the leadership of the world to declare a climate emergency. We are in an existentialist crisis because of the climate. The joint conversation by the special envoy of President Biden, Mr. Kerry, John Kerry, and the special representative of President Xi for the climate for the climate envoy is most welcome, because it offers a ray of hope. And I think China and the US, when they come together, two powerful economies, two countries which have got giant intellectual talent, giant potential. I mean, China is the biggest, or produces half the world's solar energy in terms of renewable energy, in terms of battery-powered electric vehicles, the intellectual knowledge that both the countries have gained, the experiences both countries have gained, they can actually transform the world and actually make the world much richer. As the UN, we welcome this, and now it's really rolling up our sleeves and coming down to the practical aspects of it. The Paris Agreement still remains a platform around which we must all unite, and I'm delighted that President Biden has brought the United States back to the Paris Agreement. We already have a framework, but now it's a race against time. We don't have, now the patient, the earth is in a heart attack mode, and we have to do everything to resuscitate it, prolong it, and we will lose this planet.
Right. From 2030 to 2050, China wants to go carbon zero and then carbon neutrality. That is only 30 years' time, much, much shorter than many of the industrial countries that have pledged. How do you see these goals? After all, there is still differentiated but common responsibilities. That is a principle related to Paris Agreement.
Well, first of all, let me congratulate President Xi for his courage and his commitment to announcing China's will to end carbon emissions or peak carbon emissions by 2030, and by 2060 make China carbon neutral. Now keep in mind that China and the US together they emit 40% of the greenhouse gases. I think the time is right that we start exploring together, as I said, with the intellectual capital that both the countries bring to bear, the United Nations system, member states of the United Nations coming together, because as I said, this is a common threat. The climate challenge is like the COVID pandemic. It doesn't differentiate between countries and nation states. The levels of climate-related disasters between, say, 1990 to 1999, in a span of 20 years, was about 3,500. Now, between 2000 to 2019, climate-related disasters have gone to 7,000. So it's really doubled, Tianwei. What is now important is, what are the practical things that need to happen? Can the US and China come up with one or two major highlights that could be achieved in the next 5 years, or perhaps even by 2030, and put a roadmap together? Can we also make sure that there is a localized approach as well, where there is an exchange between states in China, provinces in China, similar to that in the US, which are the ones that are like the coal belts? Where can that knowledge and technology be shared? I think when China and the US come together, it is a juggernaut that will help us to protect this planet, because as I said, there is no plan B. The Secretary General constantly reminds us, for us to recover better, we need to recover green.
But Sid, many are concerned about the back and forth thing. After all, sometimes election cycles bring certain country, every 8 years is a dramatic change of policies, and that discourages the whole international community, not to mention their own implementation of implementing the goals. How do you see that?
Well, that is why there is a needed urgency here, Tianwei. One can't predict the outcomes of elections, as we've seen anywhere in the world. And I think what we need to drive is consistency. I think the leadership that President Xi and President Biden are showing in the climate space is quite remarkable. And I think both these gentlemen, who know each other quite well for many, many years, could look at, we can put geopolitics aside. This is about the survival of the human species. And I think it's an opportunity for us to really look at the wisdom and the leadership of these two men to drive the climate change agenda. And I think we are all in this together. As I said, if we don't do it now, Tianwei, we may be a bit too late already. And therefore, that need of urgency is clear. I believe during the time of President Biden, a lot can be achieved.
For example, how much the investment put into the effort are really bringing results, let's just say money-wise, how much percent? That has been a question for the financial circle. Meanwhile, there's also worried about the greenwash. So on the one hand, really, there's enormous effort that needs to be made. But on the other hand, a very critical approach towards some of the most important areas, also crucial. How do you see this?
When I look at the whole global ecosystem, and having worked a long time in Africa, Tianwei, post the Second World War, we've had the largest displacement of people, nearly 75 million people in the last 3-4 years, and that number is increasing. A lot of those displacements are actually climate related. It's cause of instability, climate, impoverishment. A lot of them are economic migrants. So, we are in a state of flux. Now, when President Xi talks about a rural revitalization, we need a rural revitalization throughout the world. We need a rural revitalization in Africa too. I mean, look at the potential of Africa. Just that continent has the capacity of being the breadbasket of the rest of the world. And yet at the same time, we have about 50% post-harvest loss. It is a continent which imports $80 billion worth of food every year. As a matter of fact, if the technology and innovation and the big data that the China, US, India, European Union could bring together into Africa, we can make Africa prosperous. And Africa which is prosperous will mean a prosperous world, simply because that population is going to be 2.5 billion by 2050. There'll be large number of young people. It's an opportunity for us to make those investments there. So from a timing point of view, when you look at the Bao report, it talks about 4 deficits in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. First, the health deficit. Second, the infrastructure deficit. Third, the green deficit and the lack of green development. And fourth is the digital deficiency. We need to plug this, and we can, given the fact that the COVID-19 has struck us like a bolt of lightning, and it has illuminated all the inequalities in the world. Now is the time to fix that. But 2030 is an agenda which China has signed up to, the US is signed up to, the entire world is signed up to. Let's use this as a pathway for not only improving our own lot, but improving the whole of humanity.
Of course, later this year, there are several important conferences going on worldwide. Glasgow is one of them. And then there's also the issue of biodiversity. That will be also a forum in China. So how do you see these benchmarks, timelines, likely to help us push the agenda one step at a time?
I think what this is doing is renewing multilateralism. That is so important.
We hope that will be the case.
It is so important. Look, I saw President Xi's speech in Davos this year. His call to action, his clarion call of reminding the world on the importance of multilateralism, of the importance of global governance, on the importance of the United Nations. I think the time has now come for us to unite. We've heard from President Biden that the United States is back in the UN with full force. I believe that this is the time. What Glasgow is offering us is giving us the best opportunity of that renaissance of multilateralism, of bringing the world together with a common agenda, a common narrative. Listen, we are divided by our politics and our races and our perceptions of things and our governance, but we are united by our common humanity. A mother in China is no different from a mother in Africa, is no different from a mother in America. We all ache when we find our child is sick. The earth is sick, and we just have to come together to preserve it.
Sid, you've been here in China for several months already. Of course, you just met President Xi and present the letter of credence. But the thing is, when you are here, you got to know how this country is going. But you also got to digest and sink in how the rest of the world, or some parts of the world, is reacting to China. How do you see the nature of your job now?
When the UN was started in 1945, the UN Charter is about building of bridges and bringing people and civilizations together, because we've come out of 2 brutal world wars which had decimated human societies, which had decimated economies all over the world. In fact, it's something which people are still recovering from. We don't want to go back to that. And therefore, the UN's role is to make sure that we provide that platform of dialogue. And therefore, the Secretary General reminded all world leaders at one point, he made a remarkable statement. He says, the world is in pieces, but we need world peace. And that world peace will happen when we have China, US, Russia, France, UK, the permanent members of the Security Council coming together and say, there are geopolitics, there is confrontation, but let's look at opportunities of dialogue and collaboration, because given the post-pandemic recovery, human prosperity will be dependent on how much of economics and how much of trade and how much of commerce and how much of free movement of goods, services and people take place. just like the pandemic, we can't isolate nation states. When John Donne said, no man is an island, every man is a piece of the continent, we are precisely that. And therefore, I believe, I feel a sense of optimism, if you're sensing it from me, when I've come here to Wow, and I'm looking at thousands of people actually coming together without being fearful of actually infecting it with each other, has shown that a public health response has worked, and it has shown the resilience, the discipline, and how science in China has worked in terms of the prevention agenda, even before vaccines started to come. This is the knowledge that the rest of the world must be shared with. This will allow the world not only to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, but come out stronger and much more resilient and be able to better protect ourselves against a future pandemic. The environment has given us another space for the world to unite and come together in terms of the preservation of humanity. But mutual prosperity, you can't decouple people from each other. We are integrated. That's what economics is all about. I see massive opportunities there. And then making sure that the digital landscape gets connected, because that is what people are getting left behind because of the digital landscape. And I see the rural revitalization program addressing those 4 deficits that the Wow Forum talked about: health, green, infrastructure, and digital. I believe we would be able to make dramatic progress. The 2030 is still achievable. We've had setbacks. Over 150 million people have fallen back into poverty because of the COVID crisis, and yet we see a country, China, in which 90 million people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 7 years.
Yeah.
I believe there are many lessons that can be shared.
What about international governance? Of course, you are belonging to the UN system, which is an important component of the international governance after World War II. But the question is, what's next? There are improvements that needs to be made to the earlier system, including the UN. There are also new platforms that needs to be invented and worked on in order to address the new factors. What do you make of the realities of adjustment that we can do?
When the Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres took over as the Secretary General in 2017, he came in with a very clear plan. He wanted to reform the UN. So his vision of the UN is 1, a UN that is fit for purpose. 2, a UN that delivers as one. 3, a UN that leaves no one behind. He made it clear to every resident coordinator in the world, ladies and gentlemen, you have to march in lockstep with the government's vision, with the government's aspirations, and make sure that you have integrated into the psyche of the people. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I see my posting here to China as truly a privilege at a time when the world is in that decade of action. We are 9 years away, and I'm seeing a country which is catapulting itself towards the 2030 agenda and virtually hitting most of the goals, whereas we are seeing 13 of the goals already being affected by the post-COVID or the COVID crisis. Now, what is it that we could do in that space which the Secretary General has envisioned? What is good is most member states, including China, who have come strongly behind his reform agenda. That reform agenda is going to redefine the UN in many ways and repurpose us, in a sense, in that country and in a context of how the UN, for example, in Africa, can work with China, with UN country teams and host governments in Africa, so that we can bring the big data, the technology, the innovation, the best practices together in terms of China's development. This is what the SDG advocate for the UN, Jeffrey Sachs, he's also our SDG advocate here in China, emphatically said, we need to make sure that the world unites with a common perception of human prosperity. And that is happening here. And these are lessons that can be shared with the rest of the world. And that I see is a part of the global governance architecture.
Well said, but the building trust is extremely important. Given your rich experience in Africa, in other countries, how to do that? Of course, in different roles, there are different ways, but how to have a common denominator to have trust? Your take.
Best denominator in this is the United Nations itself.
I know you would say that.
No, but the presence, it really is. I mean, look, in Kenya, for example, we had a public-private partnership platform, is seen as one of the most successful enterprises which has brought governments, which has brought the private sector, which has brought the UN, which has brought civil society together with a common vision towards Kenya's development agenda. I want to create something similar here with the government of China, with the private sector of China, with the private sector of multinational corporations, so that we could then connect with the UN system and governments on the other side and look at mutual reinforcement and how we can improve. What the UN is best at doing is providing the best human capital at the places where these projects and programs are being implemented. So the UN is becoming increasingly ambidextrous. One is to provide the best policy guidance to the governments we work with, and at the bottom, to be the boots on the ground to make sure we leave no one behind. And this is where our expertise of public health or agriculture or water sanitation, environment, public finance management, all these are critical elements that need to go into providing those capacities into places where this is being done. Don't forget, China in 1979 had a per capita GDP, Tianwei, of $180. $180. The US at that time had a per capita GDP of $15,000. The US per capita GDP has gone up by 4 times. It's about $60,000 today. China has gone up by 100 times. It's at about $12,000 today. These are lessons which we can actually bring into the African landscape. Who best to provide it when you have the entire might of the UN country team present in a host country to be able to provide that guidance?
Last question. We are in a time of great transition, as the title of this year's Boao Forum, A World in Change. So you are also standing particularly at the crossroad, trying to link China with the rest of the UN system and also bring the UN goals and sustainable development goals with the work of China. How do you see the fine balance you need to take, and also the special responsibilities that you have here?
Very clearly, first of all, I don't need to create a reason for China to embrace the SDGs. China has embraced the SDGs and is constantly talking about it. China has embraced multilateralism and is talking about it. At the time I presented my credentials to President Xi, he reminded all the ambassadors present there about the importance of the United Nations systems and allowing global governance, which allows dialogue and diplomacy and collaboration and trust building. Tianwei, I feel that over the last few years, there is a bit of a trust deficit. World leaders like President Xi and President Biden can actually help to build that. Mr. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, is absolutely clear. He wants a world which is a better world, a world that trusts each other, and we rekindle the spirit and the renaissance of multilateralism. I believe the moment is now. The next 9 years, we can actually come out as a much better world, much prosperous world, much finer world, a world that really cares for each other, and finally, a more compassionate world.
Your sense of passion is absolutely contagious. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Mr. Resident Coordinator. That's the UN Resident Coordinator in China. The Boao Forum has closed for this year. A lot of takeaways, and we are sharing with you throughout the programs from this week. On behalf of my team here in Boao and in Beijing, thanks for watching. Bye for now.